Hi, this is William Henderson.
And this is B. McGraw.
And this is the Unjerked podcast. So this is episode 2 on our series on welfare. So insurance, flood insurance. Yeah, we could talk briefly about natural disaster insurance. I
think we talked about it recently, but I think it's worth mentioning because it's its own form of welfare.
Yeah. So, insurance as an industry needs to bring in more money than it pays out, or else it's not functional, or it can't sustain itself. And so insurance works best for unpredictable, rare events. So, like, for example, a tree falls on your car, or you get cancer out of nowhere. It does not work well with predictable, broad systemic issues. So, for example, mechanical issues are not covered by auto insurance. Yep. If your alternator breaks, that's not covered by insurance because it's something, it just happens. Every single car, parts are going to break because mechanical things break, whereas accidents can be due to unpredictable, a driver who's not paying attention and hits your car, for example. And in terms of, widespread events, a lot of flood insurance has to be subsidized by the government because it's just covers a wide swath of the local population. Fire insurance is the same thing. So a lot of those programs are becoming socialized, essentially. A lot of disaster insurance in Florida there's a state insurance program. And then in California, there's the forest fires now. A lot of the local insurers exited the market because it didn't make sense financially to them. So that's a big question mark is like, to what degree should socialized insurance programs exist? Because, the question mark is like, does it incentivize risky behavior? Does it make sense to build a house in the middle of a very fire-prone forest, for example? So anyways, that's not, I don't know if that counts as welfare, but that's something.
It doesn't quite fit the most of this episode, but it's kind of a tangential topic to welfare.
Yeah. Overall numbers, we talked about the different programs, but basically old age programs, so Social Security, pensions, as well as Medicare, are about $1.98 billion. Poverty-based programs, according to this Congressional Research Service white paper as of 2020, it was $918 billion. And then I did not calculate other programs outside of poverty and old age. But those are mostly veteran-based, unemployment insurance, etc. So old age, twice as much money is spent on old age programs versus poverty programs. And then when you look at percentage of GDP per that previous OECD article, 8.5% of U.S. spending is on healthcare, public welfare, pensions, public pensions, 7.2%, and then other welfare is 2.8%. So the conclusion from that is like most welfare is for the elderly or focused on healthcare. When people talk about welfare and welfare queens, my interpretation of that is it's mostly a discussion. It's mostly focused. I think it's a political targeting of low-income urban people from racial minorities. I think that's a pretty fair to say. That's what people usually mean when they sell. When they talk
as far
about
as
welfare.
The scapegoating goes,
yeah. But the reality of where the money goes does not reflect that. Most money goes to older people, and then when money does go to poor people, a large chunk of that is for healthcare. But
really,
when people use the term welfare queen, I think that usually references Section 8 vouchers and TANF, basically cash transfers for low-income families. I think that's what people have in mind when they complain about welfare queens. And that just is not a huge percentage of the welfare budget. So I think that is not a fair characterization of the welfare system. because most welfare goes to old people. You know, it's not like if you go to the, if you go to like, low income neighborhoods, they're not like, they're not making it rain with like welfare payments. So there's that. What makes a good welfare design? So you want to incentivize work. So you want to taper off benefits at a rate slower than wage gains. So, for example, for every extra dollar you make, you want to taper off benefits by less than $1, because that still leads to people coming out ahead if they make more money. You don't want a system where, let's say you make $1 extra and your benefits drop by $2. In that case, you're losing out by making more money.
Mm-hmm.
So you want the tapering off to happen at a slower rate than the increase in income. And you also don't want sharp eligibility cliffs. So you don't want to cut off where it's like, if you make less than this amount, you get all the benefits. If you make $1 more than that, you get no benefits. That's obviously bad.
Yeah, because that prevents people from just accepting jobs in general.
Yeah. You want it to be simple. You don't want a ton of forms and a ton of bureaucracy. You want clear, obvious rules and easy online applications. I think that's pretty uncontroversial. You want it to be targeted. It should be targeted towards people who need it. You should not have welfare go to billionaires, for example. And every single billionaire in this country probably gets Social Security payment. I mean, people, if they're retirement age, they probably get Social Security payments. Just because, if you work a certain number of years, you get Social Security benefits. And does it make sense for a billionaire to get Social Security payments? Probably not.
No, not at all. But I also feel like the personality of someone who would become a billionaire would also accept Social Security payments.
Well, Ayn Rand took welfare payments when she was, in old age. And her argument was
how rich was she though?
I'm not sure, but like she took welfare towards the end of her life.
Yeah.
And so how do existing programs compare? So eligibility cliffs, so the earned income tax credit, SNAP, Section 8, etc., do a decent job. Medicaid and Medicare do a poor job because there's a specific age at which you become eligible for Medicare, for example. And then TANF is pretty bad when it comes to eligibility cliffs. When it comes to complexity of the process, so SNAP, earned income, tax credit, Social Security, Medicare are like pretty decent. SSI, SSDI, TANF, Section 8, Medicaid are pretty bad. Interestingly, a lot of programs focused on the poor are very complex and difficult to get, whereas programs focused on the elderly tend to be easier and more automated, interestingly enough. Most programs are targeted. Social Security is not targeted. Every single person who put in their requisite years of payments into the system get welfare or get payments out of Social Security once they hit eligibility age. It should because like a decent, I would say the top 10% of people over the age of 70 probably have net worths of several $1 million. Does it make sense for the government to pay out Social Security to someone who's worth, who's a decamillionaire?
Probably not at all.
Probably not, but that's how our current system is set up.
Yeah, that could be a very easy way of saving the good part of Social Security.
So, social effects of welfare. So there's an article in the Journal of Criminal Justice, How Does the Welfare State Reduce Crime? The Effects of Program Characteristics and Decommodification Across 18 OECD Countries by Rudolph and Stark. And specifically, they found that unemployment benefits have a very strong negative correlation with crime rates, which is pretty remarkable. But so many programs do not correlate with crime rates, but like unemployment benefits significantly reduce crime, which is something
interesting. That makes sense, though.
It makes sense. It makes sense. And so, like, if you're tough on crime, maybe you should support unemployment benefits, right? Mental and physical health. We had an episode on healthcare, so universal systems have better per dollar outcomes than non-universal systems. And then when it comes to elderly, so elderly people almost by definition are not economically productive because almost all elderly people do not work. But they do provide other services to society. So they can provide mentorship to younger people. They can help take care of grandchildren. They can provide a social glue. A lot of volunteering and a lot of political participation is done by elderly people. So it's good to have a place for society for the elderly. This is impossible to measure. Like, how much do social programs for the elderly help social capital? I mean, it's like, how do you measure that? It's really hard to say. The economic effects. So it's basically a deadweight loss of taxation versus increased labor supply debate. The argument is that welfare can help people get back into the labor force, etc. Welfare also is a counter-cyclical fiscal mechanism. Mm-hmm. So, according to Keynesian economics, when you have a sort of when you have a recession, you want to increase demand. And then when the opposite is happening, when the economy is strong, you want to reduce government-based demand. And a lot of welfare programs automatically encourage that. So once the economy does poorly, a lot of welfare programs kick in. A lot of people get laid off. They start getting unemployment insurance, etc. And then once people get off of unemployment, they stop getting payments. And then also when they start making more money, they start putting more into taxes. So a lot of welfare programs can be quite effective in counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Automatic.
Yeah.
A lot of fiscal policy that is legislated by Congress is like infrastructure projects, because a lot of the welfare-based projects are not projects, but a lot of the welfare-based programs are kind of automatically done by statute.
Really?
Yeah.
It's automated? Huh.
Well, just because like when people for example, Medicaid and unemployment insurance is based off of whether you're employed or not, or whether you're poor or not.
Oh, yeah.
So when more people, in a recession, more people fall into poverty. And so automatically payments start going out into those programs. And then in boom times, people make more money. And when they're in higher tax brackets, they put more money into taxes, for example.
Yeah.
And a lot of this is interregional. So a lot of money goes into rural areas. In fact, like most rural areas are not economically self-sustaining. They rely on federal welfare programs to support themselves. And a lot of, and the same with a lot of low-income neighborhoods in the large cities. So, really the sort of fiscal powerhouses of our country are, large metropolitan central business districts, downtown Manhattan, downtown San Francisco, downtown Houston. Like those areas are like the powerhouses that really support our economy. Unintended side effects. So do they affect birth rates and family structures? Yes, they do. So there's an article by Danzer and Ziska looking at pensions and fertility, microeconomic evidence. So they look at the expansion of Brazilian pensions for rural workers, especially, and basically what they see is that completed fertility declines by 1.3 children within 20 years after reforms, etc. And so, elderly, programs that support the elderly do reduce fertility. However, welfare programs that support young families increase fertility. So
I think a lot of people are calling for that.
Yeah. So there's an article, Family Benefits and Econometric Analysis by Gauthier and Hotzius. And they basically said increasing the value of family allowances by 25% would result in a 0.6% increase in fertility levels in the long run. And then the impact of family policies on fertility trends in developed countries by Lucy Grulich and Thevenson. And they basically said that policy levers don't have all the same weight in cash benefits covering childhood after the year of childbirth, have a larger potential influence on fertility than leave entitlements and benefits granted around childbirth. I mean, pretty obvious in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense that would be the case. Yeah,
I think there's a lot of like consternation around lower fertility rates, and there's a strong argument that it's bad for society in terms of it lowers the overall strength of your society to have a smaller population. I mean, look at the strongest societies. The strongest countries in our world are the largest countries. China, India, US. But also, if you have an inverted population pyramid, a lot of social functions stop working.
Yeah, the population pyramid is kind of the boogeyman of social welfare. Since
I think
so much goes into old age and retirement.
Yeah, so a lot of people blame the low fertility rate on just like degeneracy. I think that's just not accurate. I think most people want to have kids. Most people want to have families, or at the very least, they'd be open to being like aunts and uncles. It's primarily a financial issue. It's primarily, financially, it just doesn't make sense to have children for a lot of people. They're like, I don't make enough money, etc. And so, old age benefits obviously reduce fertility because it reduces the opportunity. It reduces the cost of not having children. Because in the old days, if you had no children, you could end up in poverty basically as you got older. And then, with family benefits, I mean, it's just common sense. I think our modern system disproportionately benefits the elderly. And disproportionately does not benefit young families. The childhood poverty rate is higher than the overall poverty rate, which at the surface level doesn't make sense. It's like, well, why? Because like children are like part of families, and so shouldn't that be covered by the overall poverty rate? But young families disproportionately are younger, and younger people have less money, and also are lower income, generally speaking. There's a lot of high income, basically double income, no kid type people. So if you care about fertility, I think programs targeting young families is a no-brainer.
Yeah.
A lot of people, although I think a lot of people in their minds, when they think of social programs supporting young families, they think of like low income, quote unquote, undesirable families. So I think there's a certain bigotry aspect where in their opinions, they're like, well, the wrong families are getting support. I think that's the
idiocracy argument.
Right.
Yeah. Only the smart parents should have kids.
Well, the smart parents have even fewer kids because the economic cost of like entering the sort of the signaling of entering a good college, et cetera, is very expensive. You have to pay for a lot of like piano lessons and like hockey lessons and, tutoring, et cetera. That's an entirely separate issue right there. Does welfare disincentivize work? So I couldn't find any clear answers in the literature, but really it's a matter of like benefit design. Benefit cliffs are bad. You want things to taper properly. Does it affect economic growth? Again, I could not find a clear answer. So, you could argue certain programs help people rebound when they become unemployed, and that can increase productivity. But on the other hand, if there's a benefit cliff, could it trap people where economically it's better for them to just stay on welfare? So I could not find an obvious answer. Does welfare reduce internal labor mobility? I could not find a clear answer on that. Basically, my thesis on this was like, you have a lot of regions in this country that are basically economically no longer self-sustaining. Like the people who still live there primarily are able to sustain themselves, not primarily, but to a large degree because of welfare payments. So I was wondering, like, how much of, why do people still live there? Obviously, they have family connections there and stuff like that. But I was wondering, like, could welfare be a big reason why people don't have the incentive to leave those regions? I could not find a clear answer to that. The flip side to that is a lot of wealthy cities purposely make things expensive because of like housing restrictions. So could that also limit internal labor mobility? So no idea.
Yeah, because if all the jobs are in an expensive city where you can't afford the rent, then how could you even make the move in the first place?
Yeah. Does welfare increase migration from other countries? So I could not. So basically, the literature is mixed. Basically, like, they're not sure.
I've actually looked up papers on this topic myself because I've seen it so much online, and it's basically whatever you Google.
It seems like it's like that might be a reason, but for the most part, it's basically jobs. Like, migrants go where the jobs are.
Yeah,
essentially.
That's what it always boils down to. But I did also see a few where it was like, yep, migrants go to where the jobs are, and they do normally like utilize whatever welfare systems that they can to the fullest, probably because on average they're poorer.
Right. My perception, I did not research this, my perception is that in the US, there's very little social support for especially undocumented migrants. Funding issues.
It looked like there was some, but not like there is for normal citizens.
Yeah. Funding issues. So this is just the population pyramid. The number of people working, paying into the system versus pulling out of the system. There's actually a compelling argument that immigrants are good fiscally in terms of funding because they enter our country when they're already adults. So if they're already adults and they're already working, they're paying into the system. They didn't get anything out of the system while they were children. So there's a strong argument that letting people into the country who are already 22 years old, for example, is like very, very fiscally sound policy. Obviously, they can have children of their own, etc. But like, there's a strong argument it's a good fiscal policy. It's actually quite difficult to bring in. If you bring in people who are already retired, obviously that's a fiscal net negative because they're not working. Anyways, other issues. So fraud. Oh man, I didn't find a link to this, but basically the percentage of spending that was on fraud was something on the order of like 1 to 5%. It was quite low. It's not really a huge issue.
Well, here's one question I've been thinking of since you mentioned that there isn't a lot of fraud. Like, what's the mechanism to look for fraud?
That's a good question. I'm not completely sure.
Because if there's a low probability of detecting fraud, maybe there's fraud that's undetected. And
right.
It just kind of goes unaddressed.
Yeah. That's a fair point. I'm not completely sure about that. Gaps in the U.S. system. So categorical gaps. So healthcare. So a lot of people who are self-employed, who are gig workers, who are part-time workers, do not have access to cheap insurance. There is an ACA market, which is better than the old system, but that's a big gap where people on Medicaid have insurance. People who are full-time employed usually have insurance, but that gray zone in between oftentimes is difficult. Unemployment insurance is difficult to access for gig workers and intermittent workers. There's not a great childcare support system in the U.S., and then there's not a lot of housing assistance in the U.S. Section 8 is not very expansive. Some programs are hard to access because of like bureaucracy and stuff, disability, TANF, etc. And then there's structural issues, like I mentioned before, fragmented care, benefit cliffs, lack of tapering. One thing I've kind of thought is like, should we have a central agency that has like a database on for each person, like what are the different programs they're on to better integrate welfare programs. Inefficiencies. So if you compare it to a negative income tax, so according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, so this is an old article from 2012, but basically their research shows that 1 to 8% of spending goes to admin. So that's the, when you think of like, inefficiency, that's basically, there's admin costs, and then like I mentioned before, the fraud. Negative income tax, it's not been tried enough for there to be a lot of data on it. And negative income tax probably would not work for healthcare, because I think, like per our previous episode, the issue with healthcare is primarily about market design. You need a very broad pool of risk. You need clear pricing. You need strong bargaining position through large payers. And then, like, negative income taxes would not be effective in disincentivizing externalities like junk food, alcohol, etc. Although you could argue, should people, like, why can't people just make that decision on their own? So you added a comment on here.
Oh yeah. For a lot of, food programs, I have heard a lot that people will be like, oh yeah, they're just going to use those food stamps on junk food or whatever benefits on alcohol. And, just they're spending it wrong. We're trying to help you, but they're wasting all of our help on bad decisions. So why even help people?
Yeah. So I'm going to end this. I usually don't do this on these episodes, but here's kind of me editorializing on like what are some ideas that I think would be good based off what I kind of researched. I've actually really warmed to the idea of a negative income tax. When you look at a lot of these programs, it's like a lot of like, these are, this is how you get eligible. These are the forms you have to fill out. This is, if there's a benefit cliff, it can disincentivize people, blah, 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 blah. And I'm leaning towards like, if people need money, just give them money, and like, they know what to do with it is kind of what I'm leaning towards. Like I said, I think healthcare is an exception because that's a market design issue.
Mm-hmm.
But to a large degree, it's like, man, like if the issue with someone is like, they don't have the capital, like if you give them the capital, they'll probably figure it out. Like, I know that like oftentimes people in low income situations can spend money. Like I used to, for several years, I went to this convenience store where a lot of like working class people went to, and like, like every day I saw people spending money on like lottery tickets, and like the lottery is just one of the worst ways to spend your money. So obviously there are people who spend their money poorly. They spend money on cigarettes, lottery tickets, junk food, etc. Maybe you could like, I don't know, like maybe, food stamps that exclude those items are good. But I'm leaning more towards like, if you believe in welfare, maybe a negative income tax is the best solution for most things. Social Security currently is broad-based, so every person who paid into the system a certain number of years gets benefits on the back end. But like, if you're worth $10 million, do you really need Social Security checks?
No. There's a lot of people that are probably getting benefits that don't need it.
Yeah. And also there's a cutoff point. It was like $160,000 to $170,000 a year, where anything beyond that in terms of income, you stop paying into the Social Security system while you're working. So, there's definitely ways to improve that system. Another question is like, if you're a blue collar worker, should you get benefits earlier than white collar workers because your body's destroyed, basically?
That's a good point.
Where like, if you're a white collar worker, because like there are people who can work well into their like late 60s, even 70s, who like in white collar jobs. Whereas if you're blue collar, like your body gets wrecked.
Yeah, unless you like get Alzheimer's or something.
Yeah. I talked about universal health care. I talked about streamlining and tapering programs better. And then the last thing I want to say is like, a lot of welfare is primarily just demand subsidies, right? A lot of social issues, though, are due to supply constraints. So housing is artificially constrained in most of the country. Healthcare is artificially constrained in most of the country.
Food supply is less so, and I think that's less of a problem these days.
Yeah, food is not as much of an issue, and food, there's actually supply subsidies on food in a lot of cases. So I think food, that's not really an issue.
Yeah,
But a
it's
lot of
mostly about housing and healthcare now.
yeah.
Yeah.
So those are kind of my main thoughts. You added a couple comments. Do you want to go over
All
any of
right,
these?
let's see if we missed any of these. Let's see here. I wrote down people have been saying that Social Security is going to run out in X years for decades, and that it's getting to a boy who cried wolf situation. So I think the latest I heard is early 2030s or later, depending on what the Trump tax cuts are.
So what I will say about this is like you can make very accurate predictions based off of if you know what the tax rates are, if you know what the demographic trends are, if you know all of those things, you can make it's pretty obvious how to calculate, when do benefits run out. So obviously adjustments change as tax rates change and things like that. But like we've known, it's not so much boy who cried wolf. It's more like, okay, like we knew since, I don't know. I mean, we knew since Social Security started that like if demographics inverted, it would become unsustainable.
Yeah.
So this is something we've known about for decades. It's just a matter of like,
is this just the boomers retiring?
Yeah. I mean, that's the imminent issue.
Yeah. Which is basically in the next 5 to 10 years.
It's happening. It's going to, and
it's currently happening for a lot of people. Yeah.
The benefits are not going to get completely cut. What happens is that the benefits will be cut to match the inflows of taxes. So the benefits would probably be cut to like maybe 70% of current benefits. So it wouldn't be completely ended. It would just like be tapered down, which maybe that's the best way to deal with the issue is just like let it happen.
Man,
but basically
that could get really rough for some people.
Yeah, but like
maybe it'll force some good changes, like if you already have this much money, you don't get Social Security.
Perhaps.
Yeah, maybe. Let's see here. I also hear from people who would, in that situation, would not get Social Security, that you don't get that much off of Social Security. It's pretty much worthless. Don't plan on using it.
I think that applies more to people who are financially well off.
And have like a higher standard of living.
Yeah. If you're in deep poverty, Social Security checks can make a huge difference.
Yeah. We already talked about welfare queens and UBI. Maybe that's its own thing. Yeah, right. I think UBI is more science fiction response than anything for me. We already talked about insurances. Didn't we talk about this in the last episode? I wrote down insurance is always a scam. Yeah. Let's see. I wrote the social safety nets in the U.S. basically don't work, so why pay for them? I think
that's an all or nothing fallacy.
Yeah.
They do work. They do work. They just don't work as well as maybe they could.
Yeah. So let's fix it to be better. I completely agree, but you see that a lot. This is a slippery slope to communism. That's probably almost every topic. That is every topic that we cover.
I want to talk about this.
Okay, talk about it.
Communist countries. So number one, communist countries are very unfriendly. So this is not about labor unions, this episode, but communist countries are very unfavorable towards labor unions because labor unions are a form of civil society. When you look at authoritarian countries, the biggest threat to them are civil society. In fact, we talked about libertarianism earlier. Libertarians almost never are major players in the pushback against authoritarian countries. The reason why is libertarianism is primarily an ideological movement that doesn't have a huge base of support. You don't have a huge social structure that supports libertarianism. So when you look at the fall of communism, almost none of it happened because of libertarians. It was mostly civil society, churches, labor unions, etc. In fact, there was a labor union in Poland called Solidarity. That was a huge reason why communism fell in Poland.
Interesting.
So that's the labor union side. On the welfare side, so currently in China, Xi Jinping has been very reluctant to provide social benefits because currently they're undergoing a recession.
Yeah.
And the sort of Keynesian response is social subsidies provide benefits to people. And Xi Jinping has been very, very reluctant to do that. He's been focused much more on industrial subsidies. Basically, can we basically provide industrial subsidies to increase our export market? So when you look at communist countries, they usually don't have strong social safety nets. They usually focus much more on nationalizing industries. So the idea that that welfare leads to communism is not accurate. That's not how communist countries are formed. So I strongly, strongly disagree with that. Anyways.
I know, but I had to mention it because it's a huge argument with welfare discussions. Let's see what else I have on here. We're almost towards the end. Too hard to get on social programs. Oh, we talked about that. And yeah, the argument is it's too hard and a lot of people slip through the nets. I think this is just we got to improve the system. But yeah, it feels like it's such a balance between don't let the people that need it slip through the nets, but also prevent fraud. I don't know how you balance that. That's just a administrative wisdom situation. Mm-hmm. Also an all for nothing, let's not, destroy a whole program because it's flawed. Funding status, live in stasis because it's basically the third rail of politics.
That's
to get rid of accurate. Any social security or raising taxes.
Political kryptonite.
Yeah. So basically fixing it by raising taxes or cutting it by just getting rid of it is something that is not feasible in a democracy.
Right.
So it's just kind of living in dysfunctional stasis.
Right.
I don't know how you fix that other than convince enough people of, having wealthier and middle class people pay more money.
Right.
We already talked about the age pyramid. I'm very curious because we're going to see that pretty soon in our lifetimes, probably. Like, how is that going to play out?
It's a good question.
I think a lot of people are talking about that age pyramid. It's going to be interesting.
The natural market force is mass migration. That's why you're seeing all these people move to Italy and Germany. Honestly, I think that's just because wages are rising for a lot of low income service work because there's not enough young people to do it. Yeah. I think a lot of that is just market forces. Places like Japan, because they're an island, or South Korea, because they're basically an island. Because North Korea, there's a border, but they can use that to prevent people from coming in. But I think it's inevitable. You're going to have people come in. How else are you going to fix the population pyramid?
Yeah, I don't think there's a way.
And then
welfare is a magnet for corruption and misuse is the last point here.
Yeah, so like we mentioned earlier, it does exist. And there's a question mark of how do you measure it, like you said?
Yeah, like I said, I don't think there's a huge method of detecting fraud. Or at least it doesn't sound like you looked for it for any papers or anything on that subject. So right. I don't know. I think that's a question mark right now.
All right. That was our final part on our episode on welfare. We'll find another topic next time.